Welcome to the Thomas Glenn Pelham Silver Key Debate. My name is Riley Maxwell, a freshman at Emory University.
And my name is Maggie Howerton. I'm also a freshman at Emory.
Before we introduce the participants and professors in today's exhibition, we would like to recognize the namesake for this round. For over 13 years, Mr. Thomas Glenn Pelham served as the director of the Barkley Forum for Debate, Deliberation, and Dialogue. He was a firm believer in the unique capability of the forensic art to build character in the young people who participated, and that constructive dialogue, conflict resolution, critical thinking, literacy, and communication skills are central to a society full of civil discourse. Mr. Pelham worked tirelessly to provide speech and debate opportunities to college and high school students and believed strongly in recognizing educators who did the same.
Okay, now we're going to introduce the participants in the exhibition. On the affirmative is Berkley Preparatory School from Orlando, Florida. The first affirmative speaker is Michael Ross. The second affirmative is Samir Varkantham. And now, on the negative, is Westwood High School from Dallas, Texas. And the first negative speaker is Ethan Andrew. The second negative speaker is Pranav Balakrishnan. Okay, the evaluators of this debate are professors. First is Les Phillips. Now, Ed Williams. Cheryl Kosmeric. Aaron Timmons. Dan Lingle. Tracy McFarland. Greg Malice. Sarah Sanchez. Christina Phillips. Chris Palmer. Josh Clark. Brian Manuel. Rosie Valdez Block. Adam Smiley. Colton Gilbert.
Thank you all, and let the exhibition begin.
Before I speak, I was instructed to speak about the Barkley Forum, involvement in the activity, etc. So first, I would like to thank my parents for enabling me to come to this tournament and debate broadly. I would like to thank the administrators of our school who couldn't be more supportive of the team. I would like to thank, of course, Dr. K and Jack for being at every tournament with us, traveling every weekend, missing family time, just to ensure that we have the best possible experience to debate over the course of our 4 years. I would also like to thank Ayush, Pranay, and Aiden, our assistant coaches, who have worked really hard for us, been super helpful, etc. I would like to thank our teammates at this tournament and not have been instrumental in helping us prepare for every debate. I would like to thank Westwood, our competitors and friends. I'm sure we'll have another great debate, and this will not be the last one. And lastly, I would like to thank the Barkley Forum and the key coaches for evaluating this debate, having this great tournament. This is my first Barkley Forum. So I was not prepared for the attire or the speech, but it's been a fantastic time, and I cannot wait to come back and coach this tournament next year. So thank you. With that said, I was going to use a speech drop, if that's okay with everybody, because there's just too many emails and spectators. So the code is 4, capital Q, lowercase o, 8, lowercase w, lowercase f.
One more time.
Yeah, 4, capital Q, lowercase o, 8, lowercase w, lowercase f. Is anybody not ready? Yeah. Everybody's good? Okay. We are in the midst of a race war. It's January 26, 2025. Trump is president. DEI is repealed. January 6 protesters on the wrong side of the race war rung free. Immigrants fear ICE trucks steamrolling poor neighborhoods. IPR policy itself is forged in an eternal debate over the expansion of white humanity in all its hypocrisy. The global promise of white being determines coordinates of an always unfolding violence that is already steeped in an edifice of accessibility. Narratives of racial progress ignore the pre-established template for progress that is inextricably tied to the white humanity. This establishment of statecraft is the theater of racial nation building with vacillating movements and subtitles. Post-civil rights, multiculturalism, resurgent white nationalism, post-racial liberalism, law and order, the war on drugs, the war on terror, in the infrastructures of tolerance and repression that are never finally separable. Rodriguez 19. Contrary to liberal narratives, white national reform is everywhere. Against all evidence of racial progress, gestures of subjection are promises of postponed futurity for those who fit the civil enemy profile of racial domestic war. Post-civil rights, multiculturalism, white nationalism, and infrastructures of repression are never separable. Internal debate over the violence of white humanity offers humanitarian favors against the urge to violently decline. When people loot, the inevitability of suffering explodes the white universal. The most alienating feeling, the limits of internal debate, are whether a potential expansion of its collective is capable of altering the intensity of casualties. Militancy is misread by organized compromises of the nonprofit industrial complex. The problem is not desire for protective capacity and duress. Rather, the internal debate can only allow concession, which subsists on policing and equitability. Winning protective capacity is only for now. Adjudication of debate occurs in symbiosis with the enforcement of cultural, juridical, military statutes that affirm the anti-civilizational profile, the black and aboriginal grasp for decency, the brutalizer's decency. The protest claims that remind them that we are not criminals. The delusion is willful. Civil war is always global. Those who have been enslaved find power in the fight. They are upset. You cannot appreciate how far you have come. Supremacy is violently enforced, from genocidal to low-intensity cultural symbolic. The end of official apartheid are maneuvers of anti-racist reform. White being assembles common sense. There is an invitation to fantasize a people of color future. Rebellions of the classroom bear insurgency among people who refuse to be willing participants in an oppressive system. These do not rely on massive numbers, but rather pivot on the willingness of committed collectives to strategize. Such work has the capacity to spark revolutions. Now, from cases like Supreme Records v. Decca Records to Stowe v. Thomas, the resolution's call for intellectual property protection cannot be disarticulated from these racialized epistems that preconfigure whiteness as superior in civilized GATS 20. IP narratives are oversimplified in public conversations in ways that center whiteness. Copyright, patent, and trademark continues to be race, constructed by racial capitalism through speeches. Regimes are imagined through racialized notions. Racial episteme a priori constrains people of color. Racial scripts are flexible. Scripts can be baked into seeming colorblind ideals. Operates as a space of racial formation. Reproduces color as lacking the capacity to create. Racial rhetorics marks some bodies as incapable. Thus, in the face of the violence of the resolution, we affirm militant preservation, the unsettling feeling of the opposite flow, one that begins at the moment of sociopoiesis, that harnesses the energy of sociality against the perversive fixation of policy, that refuses the violent corrective and violent touch of white being in favor of a new feeling, a haptic relationality where we open ourselves to the possibilities of possibilities, one where we gather dispossessed feelings in common as we undercommon, the capacity to feel through others, for others to feel through you, for you that to feel them feeling you. Element 16. A performative event repeated with each reading can be a rupture of institutionality, to undo their logics, individualizing, rationalizing, and their will to fix, both involved with the reduction and command of the social individual. Sociality itself is resistance. Policy is a name for political control and command. Control social reproduction by diagnosing incorrectness for those in need of improvement. We should counterpose planning to policy. It begins with militant preservation in the face of policy. There's nothing wrong with us. Logistics containerized bodies, objects, affects, information for circulation is capital. To logistics, Harney and Moten counterpose hapticality or love, the capacity to feel through others, for others to feel through you, for you to feel them feeling you. The Undercommons repeatedly performs the defeat of neoliberal proceduralism by the socio-poetical imagination. Those term for the non-place of abolition of beneath and beyond of the university inhabited by maroons, castaways, and fugitives, and an apositionality of being together that renews our sense of institutions as sites where the form and appearance of social being and collectivity is determined through social action and contest. For a broader sense of collective social being, the neoliberal forms of institutional power let us imagine and practice institutionality can be made anti-intuitively that empower us to try to inhabit social being otherwise, reminding us that radical change requires structure. Debate itself is a microcosm of the race war. Kelsey 19. We are haunted by civil war. Liberal commentators express anxiety about unraveling our national fabric, polarization, identity politics that destroys persuasion, disenchantment with institutions. The crisis that drives desire for normalcy invites us to rethink debate, to pose a different question that does not redeem a past that never was. Rather than make debate great again, I sit with the vertigo. Such will require we rethink the parameters of debate as dialectical, agonistic contestation of the possible. My central interlocutor will be blackness. The Greeks refer to civil war as stasis. Stability or also meaning. Stasis doubles as a constant permanence of war, even in peace. Stasis means there is ground in the form of prior consensus on disagreement. Stasis speaks to a disavowal of ungroundedness. Must one have presupposed common ground to proceed in argument? Refusing this disavowal enable us to think of ground as a war against its own void via anti-blackness. To say that debate is impossible is to beckon to war on the horizon. Blackness threatens stasis with incoherence. To leave raciality by the wayside is disavow the race war, and polite discussions that acknowledge racial terror maintain white innocence that pathologizes the black utterance of rage by adjusting the impossible demands of blackness to the acceptable terms of debate. Blackness can only appear an afterthought. Fiat and policy simulation is uniquely bad for activist skills needed in the midst of a race war. Traber 18. Fiat is uniquely bad training for activists. If you are not advocating the state, fiat is impossible. The solvency of collective action cannot be separated from the things that are done in the collective action, which is true for all non-state actors. There is no fair version of the critique that is at all meaningfully similar to the critique. Many debaters assume that the only pragmatic politics occur through the state. This is not the case. The feminist movement's intervention on norms are examples. The percentage of debaters who will have a chance to be internal to the state is minuscule, but all debaters engage in non-state movement politics. Combating anti-blackness cannot be policy. None of the major social movements were driven by policy action, and fiating radical politics hides the radical politics. Claims about the necessity of state action are besides the point. The work that debaters want to exclude by insisting on fiat is exactly the type of thing that radical politics does. Fiat trains debaters to think like legislators, not like organizers. But the only way to have substantial change from the status quo is to organize. Fiating with radical politics teaches the wrong education. Different perspectives can give guidance. Its insistence on fiat in round functions to erase minority perspectives empirically. Policy is used as a weapon to preclude discussion. Framework excludes epistemic contributions from people outside the mainstream. The erasure of critique from the outside means that we cannot trust the plan. Commitment to concepts rather than policy is more pragmatic than fiat. The things we learn when we fiat are useless, and to say it is unfair demonstrates a failure of creativity and conservative insistence to a narrow window of political tactics. The logistical strive to shape uniform, governable, and mappable subjects facilitates a racist pathology that destroys any possibility for resistance or political imagination. Quan 17. In political science, policies persist in their views that ungovernability is conceptually nonsensical, which owes an epistemological ordering that relies on state addiction. This affliction is a pathology that renders sufferers entirely dependent on the state for sensibility and intelligence. Prominent is the state-centric analytics commit addicts to a certain notion of the state, even to the extent of the state becoming the very fiction that we fear. Rather than imagining the future in terms of formations of justice, state addicts leave us dependent on the state for means of expression in terms of engagement. Their imaginary domains are thus entirely dependent on the state's projections, and the state's memory becomes our own memory. I will send this card out after. From Charleston to Charlottesville to Floyd to January 1st to the 1776 Project, our social and political reality is defined by and through racial violence. Bicycle 24. January 6th attack was not unanticipated. It was brazenly violent, choreographed assault. Charlottesville, Floyd, clash over removal of Confederate monuments. Parents brawled over bathroom policies. Everyone agrees our country has never been more divided. Culture and history wars of the 80s and 90s help us appreciate the seriousness of what is unfolding, the very real danger of what is alarmingly new about the divided state of our situation. The 1776 report aimed to become the new national common sense.
I will send that out.
Do you want to wait for the card?
I think it's okay.
Okay.
We'll start.
Yep.
Alright, ready?
Yep.
Can we, in debate, try to prevent the race war?
Well, it's not a question of preventing the race war, but rather training the activists and protesters who are able to then go on to the next steps of life and fight in the race war,
Right.
resist it,
I
etc.
understand that part, but what does it mean to enact the militant portion of that strategy? Like if we in debate engage in sociality, which is what your
Sure.
tag says, how does that result in militant preservation?
Well, our argument is that black and brown debaters and organizers now are drained from ongoing racialized crackdowns, etc. All of our uniqueness questions, the Rodriguez evidence and the Bicycle evidence, say that it is impossible to engage the state breed skills, etc., without the question of militant preservation being a first and foremost priority to recharge the social and spiritual energy of those black and brown organizers that are necessary to fight and win the race war.
Well, I'm still kind of confused about that because you've made the claim that in debate we should engage in sociality. Is that true?
Right. In debate, we should engage with sociality, but that is not all we should do.
But
We
how
have
does that
made it-
result in militant preservation?
Well, our argument is that we should train. I was getting there. Our argument is that we should have method v. method debates where we compare competing fugitive militant strategies that look like KVK debates. You could read something like the capitalist K. You could say that we should instead organize in a different way, critique our method of organization, etc. We think those debates are valuable because they train us to have the skills to refine our strategies, etc. So that when we leave debate after these short 4 years, we're better equipped to handle the real world.
There feels to be a little bit of a conflict there. How can debate both be a site to compare strategies and a site for sociality?
Well, just because debate has to be a site to compare strategies does not mean it must be hostile. We think that our strategy that we have affirmed is militant preservation, i.e., we think that judges should uphold the standard of black and brown debaters being able to care for one another, black and brown people creating enclaves like the BPP breakfast programs in the 80s, etc.
How does a world of debate where we engage in sociality differ from how debate currently works?
Well, that would beg the question of method v. method debates, which I explained earlier. Our argument
Well,
is that
that's the part that allows us to compare competing methods. I'm asking about
Right.
how your model is different in, relating to sociality.
I don't understand the question.
Like, how is like you said, voting F makes us more sociable. Like, we'd vote for a model of debate where we increase sociality in debate. Is that correct?
Okay, sure.
Right. How does that differ from the way that debate is now?
Well, so I think that the misunderstanding you're going through is our argument is that the AF injects sociality in debate, i.e., we have said our strategy is desirable because that strategy produces sociality. The question of sociality is not really tied to our model of debate. That is more about method v. method, advocacy testing, etc.
Okay. The Kelsey evidence discusses the idea that there are political and social institutions that currently cause racism. Can those institutions ever change to become less racist?
Of course, but we think that in the race war, our argument is that sociality is a prerequisite. And the Traber card says that fiat is the wrong pathway to create advocacy skills.
I've sent the doc for the 1 and C. Before I start, I'd like to give a thank you to both my parents and my sisters. Both have been absolutely instrumental in my growth as a person, but also in debate. Without them, I definitely would not be here, so I have all the thanks to give to them. I would also like to thank our coaches. First, Dominic Henderson. He came in a couple years ago, and transformational change for a program. It's never been better before. And then Kevin Hearn, the coach. Unfortunately, he's not here at this round right now, but he's been absolutely vital for this tournament and for us. I'd also like to thank Barkley Forum, all of the people here who spend all their weekend, all their week preparing for this, all the time, mental energy. All of that is something I can never say enough thank you for. I'd also like to thank all the key judges. All of you have put immense time into this and spending about 2 hours and then more time deliberating over the decision. Thank you all for doing that. Now, with that said, the order for this speech will be 2 off-the-case positions, and then I will go to their arguments on the case. Alright. Is everybody good with that order? Right. Then I will begin. First off-case position is topicality. Our interpretation is that the affirmative must defend the resolution. Berkeley Preparatory violates as per the following definitions. First, the text of the resolution calls for debate on hypothetical government action, Erickson 3. Each topic contains key elements. 1, an agent doing the acting, the United States. 2, the verb should that urges the action, for example, should. Adopt means to put a policy into action. The debate is about whether something ought to occur. Next, the United States federal government is the 3 branches, U.S. Legal 16. The USFG serves sovereignty, has 3 branches, 1, legislature, 2, executive, and 3, judiciary. Powers not assigned to the federal government are to the states or to the people. Resolved before the colon denotes a formal resolution, AWS 13. The colon introduces a formal resolution after the words resolved. IPR are rights over exploitation of information. Jawhost 98. Definition: IP is a generic term. Trying to define is difficult. Most definitions list examples rather than attempting to define essential attributes. IPR is non-physical, abstract objects, and IPR rights over exploitation in information. Patents, copyrights, and trademarks are specific categories of IPR. Tropa 18. There are 4 areas of U.S. law. Copyright protects works such as books, music, sculptures, movies, computer programs that are embodied or fixed in tangible medium. This does not require works to be entirely novel. Patents cover useful inventions, manufacturers, processes, and matter with rigorous requirements of subject matter, novelty, utility, non-obviousness. Trademarks to protect consumers from mistakes, confusion, and deception about sources of goods. Vote negative for 2 reasons. First is fairness. An unlimited, unpredictable topic disparately raises the research burden for the negative. Treat this as a sufficient win condition because fairness is a logical structure that undergirds all impacts and controls any benefit to debate. Second is clash. Putting up our positions up for debate and studying their flaws best breaks down our neural biases towards intellectual arrogance and fosters a culture of better scholarship. Our brains are terrible at knowing whether or not we're wrong and updating our beliefs. The impact is intellectual humility. Rewards a bluster instead of thoroughness that trends us and society towards extreme, unvetted positions where we criticize without accepting criticism. Resnick 19. In an increasingly interconnected, complicated world, as tech makes it easier to lie and spread false info, we need to intellectual, humble, curious people. We need to better appreciate our cognitive blind spots. It's a method of thinking, entertaining the possibility you may be wrong. Trump exemplifies how society rewards confidence and bolster, not truthfulness. When you learn how the brain works, it is not hard to be horrified. Our interpretation of reality is often arbitrary, but we're stubborn with the same observations, leads to wildly different conclusions. And why people perceive black men to be more threatening. That is racial bias, the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people overestimate their abilities, experience, and masquerades as expertise. Humility can't just come from within. We need environments where it can thrive. Intellectual humility requires support from peers and institutions. It involves having critics yell at you and telling you did things wrong. That is not fun. Humility needs to be built into standard practices. That happens with transparency. You put the data out there where people check out to improve it, come up with new ideas. We need a balance between conviction, humility, and Trump suggests there's too much conviction, not enough humility. In current culture, next off-case position is the negation criticism. Debate is not a microcosm of the race war, and debaters are fighting for ballots, not their lives. Perpetual deliberation over militancy means the rallying cry is infinitely deferred, trapped in an academic graveyard that intensifies exhaustion. OUCB 9. Let's talk about the fight endlessly in their managed form to perpetuate deliberate. They are quick to contain us, congratulates us. There was no fight against administration here, only in its extension. As much as capital is invested in building a killing apparatus abroad, it is invested here. The university is a graveyard which produces social death to shape our distress in a way that accepted to the author state designed to make frivolous demands. We are produced by this discourse about discourse, which leaves us believing it is only words about words that matter. The university gladly permits lectures on to inoculate us against confrontational radicalism and neutralize all thought and action. Vote negative for refusal. Felon 96. I speak of an active vanishing, a deliberate refusal to take the payoff of visibility. A group of theorists who take racist policies and representation strategies, while their work has become lauded with girls and remain as anonymous, refusing to participate in the visibility, is current economy members resist the fetishization of their arguments, resisting visible identities, making clear the gays who pose and arrest their work. Now I will go to the case. There is no race war. It is ahistorical and fractious coalition building that is more effective. BD 16. Some claim a race war, but in reality, the narrative warfare goes back centuries. There's a way forward. People look at violence in a different way. People have a camera. It is impossible to deny. There's no quick answers. Comparing to the 1960s, there's similarities to be hopeful about. The 60s, not only African Americans, as white, Asian, Latinos, race joins together different groups. Demonstrations all over the country rejecting a race war and choosing a nonviolent path is the only way we can win. The civil rights movement was to say you have to pick a side. Implicit racial biases are malleable. Banerjee and Morehouse 24. Implicit racial attitudes are sensitive to motivations, goals, and strategies, as well as contextual manipulations. Recent analysis using time series modeling found evidence of pervasive change bias decreased by 26%. If trends continue, attitudes would first touch neutrality in 2035. This is not restricted, pointing to widespread change. Data reveals implicit bias is malleable. These represent robust streams of evidence. Even if racial bias has psychic elements, treating those as causal and predictive is inaccurate and problematic. Kubota 24. Having bias does not necessarily indicate prejudice or likelihood from associations to actions is complex and multifaceted. It may be inappropriate to generalize from a single neural measure, even if it pertains to a significant grouping, as it does not reflect a fundamental or widespread level of prejudice. Neuroscience alone cannot fully explain biases. The field new and pitfalls can affect the rigor and inference of the research most does not represent info and context available in real-life encounters, and critical drivers of mitigators of bias. We do not censor predictive power of neuroscience. Brain imaging. Racial bias has been criticized, reinforcing the idea of inherent biases in the public, and the other scholars have instituted responsive evidence as innateness to neuromedicals, and medicalized solutions as intertwined and each have multiple functions. These claims distract from the historical and social factors. White militants will crush solvency. Cessia, 15. Organized racists and the target of the Black Lives Matter movement, and they're baited to provoke instead of snapping. The assault began with the shooting, rebel, and lashing out at people of color. Protesters or visible, a militia group showed up with a semi-automatic rifle. The group will always harm black protesters and provoke officers. There's always been a talk about the race war to amplify the conservative complex combined to open legitimacy wars against the government. A storm moving closer to activists, right-wing extremists, and form armed confrontation. It is possible oath keepers will be prevented by law enforcement. Now for the criticisms about intellectual property law. Intellectual property does not have to be bad. Contingent reforms improve status. OC 2221. IP rights has economic and discriminatory aspects. Moral rights, protection, cultural heritage. IP laws are not static. IP collective does not become inherently more oppressive because it is commercial. Human dignity is valued within IP law. Reforming IP is more effective than the alternative. Henderson 20. Public domain could be freely accessed, used, or taken only by European extracted protected indigenous people, knowledge, or assigned to public domain. And fiction serve as implicit assumption of the public domain. Public domain still classifies indigenous people's knowledge as available. Requires IP reform to be made consistent with the domain without being dominant. Do you have anything? We will send these out after. The role of the judge is to make a provisional judgment about a win or loss in one debate. Total isolation from liberal institutions is impossible. William 70. It is erroneous to think one can isolate from the institution. Isolated, initiated by the oppressed against a tyrannical establishment, militant to change. It is error for militant-minded youth to reject opportunities to join the government and service. We can attain knowledge, know-how with the threat of experimentation looming before Black Americans. It is imperative our people enter organs of establishment. Race war and choose your side rhetoric is co-opted, intensifies as clan violence. Soliton 16. After a sniper wanted to kill white people, no one is crowded louder than David Duke. This is the central black people who target whites as allied with white people who target blacks. They're the same race war team and it's jihadism, and the struggle isn't between religions. We'll mark the card at religions.
You want to leave? Yeah. It's not sent out.
It's on the initial card. Yeah. Actually, just scratch the second card that we read. I'll send out the first one though. Okay, that's it.
Okay, I have it. Give me 1 second to download it.
You ready?
Yep.
Okay. I want to first talk about the negation K. Am I correct that your thesis says our rhetoric gets trapped in the ivory tower?
Correct.
Okay, so how does your framework, which tells us to simulate but never tells us how to create policies, not also do that?
Our argument is that debates over a predictable stasis point, like the resolution that we all are available and able to see, enables us to test those ideas multiple times throughout the season at multiple levels. So it allows us to predict what our opponents will say, and then we'll go and research those ideas rigorously over and over. And that teaches us how to advocate and gives us the skills to be able to change our neural bias.
Okay, so as of the 1 and C, what claim have you made, or what is the warrant for the claim you have made that says clashing under your framework interpretation creates political advocates?
It's not simply just that we have political advocates, but rather we have the skills and the ability to study flaws in our thinking that enables us to become better people and combat biases.
Okay, sure. Let's go to the case. Your BD evidence is tagged to say there's no race war, yet the very first line of the card says the U.S. is still reeling from racial tension, and we continue to fan the fire lit in the election of 2016. How do you think that this indicates that there is no race war when the election just repeated itself and domestic militarism is only getting worse?
To be clear, when we say that there's no race war, our point isn't that racial violence never occurs. We agree that happens and is bad, but our point is not that we're not literally eviscerated in an actual war of people constantly fighting for their lives. Instead, the race relations have gone better, our evidence points to how people often try to argue that there's a race war by using cherry-picked data and
Okay.
evidence that doesn't truly substantiate.
I understand. So what evidence do you think you have read as of the 1NC that speaks to the ways that academia, research, education are all infiltrated by racism?
I don't know what you mean by like academia and all are infiltrated by racism.
Okay, so the 1AC made a claim that education is being infiltrated by agents of the race war now, like the DEI argument, etc. Where have you made a claim to the contrary as of the 1NC? Or read evidence?
Well, our evidence also speaks to the idea that our entire spaces that we operate in as people does not constantly misread in a war. For example, you've said that there's a race war and thus it is in debate as well. Our argument is there is no race war and thus it would also not be in debate.
Okay, sure. So, when the BD evidence says that racial violence may begin to decrease soon, it says that the reason for that is people now have cameras in their pockets and they fear being caught. How does that mean that people are becoming less racist?
Well, for one, that is one of the warrants, but more importantly, it also combats the structures that stop people from different minorities from combating their struggles. So, for example, it allows them to use that evidence in order to fight back and change the places they're in, the state, different people around them, and combat those neural biases.
The warrant means that people are realizing that there are consequences for their racist actions. They know that people will call them out on them, which makes them less racist in the future.
We will start.
8 minutes. $7.55 for me.
Okay. The 2AC document was sent on the speech drop. Before I give an order, there's a couple things I'd like to say. First off, I'd like to thank the Barkley Forum and the key coaches, as well as the entire Emory debate team for hosting a wonderful tournament. We really appreciate all the work all of you put into making this weekend a great experience for all of us. Next, I'd like to thank my parents and family. Despite really not understanding what we do and questioning why their son is flying around the country shouting about politics at 300 words per minute, they've always supported me and have been unbelievably accommodating. I'd like to thank our opponents, Westwood. We've had a lot of great debates. I hope we have a lot in the future, and there's no one else I'd rather be debating right now. I'd like to thank the whole Berkley Prep squad that's here this weekend. Pranay, Ayush, Aiden, Jack, Mary Claire, Emma, Mateen, Darren. All of you have been incredibly helpful, helping us in pre-rounds, grabbing paper or water. I just want y'all to know that you really do mean a lot to me, and no matter how stressful debate is, you all make it really fun to go to tournaments. Next, Michael. I personally think he's the best 2N in the country. I know some people would disagree, but the amount of work this guy does really is incredible, and his work ethic is inspiring. I've really enjoyed being one half of Berkley Prep RV the past 3 years, and I know you'll do great things in the future in college. Finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Kuzwa. I'm not sure if he's here right now, but words really aren't enough to express how grateful I am to this man. He saw the potential in a little kid with a short attention span and really made me who I am as a debater. I'm not exaggerating when I say I would have no idea what I'd be doing in high school if I'd never met Dr. Kuzwa or joined the debate team. He's with us at every tournament despite his already busy schedule from teaching at school, and as a person and a debate coach, he's amazing. He cuts so many cards for us, even if we don't end up reading them. From the whole team, I just want you to know, if you're here, we really appreciate everything you do for us. Okay, is everyone good for an order? Okay. The order is the case debate, topicality, and the criticism. Okay. Is everyone good? Great. Calls for resolution coherence cannot be disassociated from ongoing systems of logistics that confine the terms for alternative political imaginaries, forcing individuation. Racial violence structures the status quo from Project 1776 to the storming the Capitol, to the banning of CRT, white nationalism and populism is on the rise. Instead, vote affirmative for politics of militant preservation. It revitalizes sociality as a blockage that stops the process of individuation to endure ongoing logistics. It's a mode of mutual indebtedness that tells us to care for one another in the face of white institutional violence. The ballot might not end the race war, but it should not reward unethical procedures of internal debate. There is a paradigmatic imperative for militancy. There is too much at stake to deny the urgency of the race war, which threatens psychic and physical violence for black and brown people seen as militants now. The first card they read, Beatty and Raphael, says racial tensions are high now. That's their Beatty Raphael card 16. The U.S. is reeling from racial tension, more than enough anger to fan the fire. White Americans despise the Black Lives Matter movements. Black militants said racial violence was unavoidable, that we must start viewing police brutality as a human issue instead of a black or brown issue. You have to pick a side. We agree. The next argument they made is racial biases are malleable. We agree implicit racial biases are malleable. This is a reason for why it's key to engage politics at the level of the social and interpersonal, community building, because institutions are far less inaccessible, which also answers the next Kubota evidence. We have not said racial biases are an inevitable feature of the human consciousness, just that populism and white nationalism structures the status quo. The Keska card similarly agrees with the AF, that's Keska 15. Organized racists continue to rage against African-American president, gun-toting Oath Keepers. Past weekend, Confederate flag supporters launched a motorcycle convoy when Black Lives Matter protesters appeared. Rednecks brandished knives and firearms. Anniversary of the shooting of Michael Brown, Oath Keepers appeared fully armed. The Ose Tutu evidence. This piece of evidence concedes that IP was dealt from, quote, Western perspectives, which proves our arguments that the logics of property that come with it are racialized. But even if changing IP is good, it's done better from the bottom up, which is our Traber piece of evidence, which also answers the Henderson piece of evidence, because fiat, in a traditional sense, teaches nothing about how to actually engage with the political, get past things like attitudinal inherency or gridlock Congress, or a president who's completely unfriendly to progressive efforts. The Williams evidence. Infiltration takes far too long. Trump has quite literally banned DEI inclusion in federal positions. The government is uniquely exclusionary to people of color right now, which makes infiltration near impossible. Top gallery. First, debate is not a game, but a site of the race war. Uniqueness on case means you should put procedurals on hold, especially in Emory finals, to theorize for the race war. None of their benefits to their model can ever be actualized by students who might be dead tomorrow. Second is the counterinterpretation. It's militant debates over the resolution. Revolutionary versus revolutionary debates are good and solve all of their offense. That's Anastopoulos and Sakino 23. Traditional policy debates not neutral consensus, but a normalized process to racialize assumptions. Fiat is an arbitrary, extra-topical inclusion. Fiat is not inherently predictable, only a tradition. That tradition is an over-representation of white debaters, what the activity ought to look like. New conceptualizations of clash beyond this restrictive framework become necessary. Rev v. Rev debate question what moves the social. Debates do not think about material actions, shift the paradigm of debate from policy phenomenon to think critically. Racism continues the ritualistic performance of material discursive practices in academia and everyday settings. Rev v. Rev debate enables debaters to consider social change, important debates between non-state strategies. Wilderson, Moden, Tiffany King, only some examples that occur outside of policymaking. Third is the individuation dissent. Their model forces us to start with the presumption of violence out there at the level of institutions, which distance us from violence in here, proliferating racial violence at an intrapersonal level. Institutional analysis necessarily trades off with interpersonal interrogation, absent the restoration of sociality. Racialized bodies do not have the energy to enact change or legal progress, which turns all their clash and skills offense. That's Quan. Fourth is the ethical nihilism dissent. Their model forces suspended futurity. That's Euroclidus 23. Ethics of belief, lives as oppressed individuals, place faith in miracles that oppressors will have change of heart. Pursuing a goal which is unattainable condemns one to perpetual disillusionment. White people transformed argumentation, source of stress, anxiety, misguided belief in reparations, germinate psychic harms, prolonged false hope, devolve into depression, nihilism, spiritual death. Victims cease to fight back. This is defeatism, internal total constant disappointment, overwhelmed resignation. Expressions include self-inflicted reactionary suicide. 5 is the artificial legitimacy dissent. The truancy will inevitably say, inherency teaches us the state is currently doing something wrong, which is precisely the model of education we've impacted her. The lens of contingency framing, through which fiat teaches us that state action is possible, is actively violent and spiritual draining. They condemn black and brown students to sit through individual areas of political controversy for 4 years to come to the ultimate conclusion that the U.S. is politically illegitimate. That might be psychologically nourishing for students whose entire lives have been characterized by government worship, but for minority students whose lives at every turn have been characterized by U.S. political and social racism, it only magnifies anguish. Now, fairness. First, there's no impact. Fairness cannot be an intrinsic good. It only becomes one once they have justified why maintaining a game that is currently violent is important. Every disadvantage above is a disad to fairness because it's about the integrity of the game. We haven't said all norms of debate are bad, just T that requires us to read hypothetical government action. Second is fairness is non-unique. There's 4 alt causes. A is teams break new all the time, which means total preparedness is impossible. B is currently there's a unique incentive to run to the margins in policy debate in order to avoid links to disadvantages. C is unequal funding. K-debate requires less card output, which makes it uniquely accessible to small programs with limited card cutting output. D, plain text standards are at an all-time low. They are barely words, they just say the words in the resolution without any additional mandates, which makes it impossible to debate, even in policy debates. Clash. First, there's natural limits on the amount of critical literature on intellectual property, which means there is no explosion of limits because there is only a limited amount of literature in the first place. Second, their forms of clash are bad. The Traber evidence from the 1AC is fantastic. It says that we ought to prioritize non-state strategies, since an infinitesimally small amount of us will ever be internal to the state, but all of us can engage in non-state movement building, which is why it should be prioritized. Now, the criticism. First, the ballot is good. The ballot in the finals of a tournament like the Barkley Forum shifts the research paradigms of debate, especially with all these spectators here, because it sends a signal to the community that non-planned focus engagement can be fruitful. Second is uniqueness. Academic commodification is inevitable in the status quo. Trump bans on critical race theory, removal of DEI, means their argument about academic graveyards are the status quo, and there's no impact. Third is permutation do both. You can refuse colonialism in the academy while simultaneously affirming our method. Fourth is the alternative fails. That was cross-ex. Their card is talking about how we must remain invisible. That is impossible in today's political and climate, where police have things like surveillance technology, and the government is able to spy on people that they believe to be oppositional to them, which makes it impossible to remain guerrilla or invisible to the state. I'll see the rest of the time.
Are you good for cross-examination?
Aye.
First, I want to start on the case. When you're answering the Osei Tutu evidence, you said that it was based on Westwood logics, so thus it must be Western and racialized.
Well, that was not the only argument. Regardless of whether or not IP must always be racialized, our argument is that insofar as changing it is good, it is best to do it through the bottom up rather than top-down approaches through governmental policy.
I understand. I just want to talk about this answer. Why does the IP coming from Western civilizations mean it always has to be racialized?
Well, again, like, we haven't said that it always must be racialized, but rather it was initially developed with Western perspectives in mind, which might provide evidence for our arguments on topicality, why it's not always good to unconditionally affirm intellectual property.
Okay, that makes sense. On topicality, you said we should put procedures on hold. What does it mean to do that?
Yeah, so in the context of this one round, it looks like every judge on the panel refusing to vote for arguments like fairness in the face of the violence of the status quo. We've made multiple arguments for why our political and social climate is structured by white nationalism and populism. Given this political scenario, it is best to engage in non-state strategies because the political right now, or legislation, or the government, remains inaccessible to people of color.
So those procedures you would put on hold are like fairness and clash, correct?
Yes.
Is your argument that scholars and activists who are fighting for their lives do not need fairness either?
That is not our argument. Our argument is that even if fairness and clash are good in other instances, the judges should put it on hold, especially if we are true that the status quo is structured by a race war.
Should they put
Even
it on hold for activists who are fighting for their lives as well?
I was getting to that. Like, our model doesn't preclude all fairness. That was the defense I did below. It is possible to engage with other non-state strategies. In fact, the Anasopoulos and Sakino evidence is absolutely fantastic. It's written by two debaters and debate coaches, which is how you know it's the most contextual. It says that Rev v. Rev debates can include things like Moten versus Tiffany King or Wilderson v. Sexton, non-state-based strategies that have critical debate.
That
means
makes sense.
Even if
I would like to ask a different question. The ethical nihilism TA. I'm a little confused. How does this apply to our interpretation of topicality?
Yeah, so the very first card you read on topicality is the Erickson piece of evidence. It says debates ought to be about hypothetical government action. We've impact turned that premise. The ethical nihilism dissad says repetitively imagining the world becoming better only to relieve debate and realize that it isn't only magnifies anguish.
So does this argument relies on us believing that these advocacies would actually happen? As
Well,
debaters, we
not
don't really
necessarily.
believe that.
In
So
fact,
why does
if
this
you are
apply to our
correct that
violation?
debaters do not believe their advocacies happen, then it only magnifies our offense. Because it proves that if debaters truly don't believe what they advocate, then there is no reason why they should be advocating for policy options when instead they can gain skills about non-state strategies.
We'll start that. Right next. Okay, 7:31.
The order is just topicality, and there are no cards.
Okay.
Before I start, I'd like to quickly extend a few thank yous to the key coaches for driving this debate, taking a few hours out of their day to come here and help us enjoy this activity that I love so much. My parents for supporting me, encouraging my debate career, paying for tournaments, driving me to the airport at, crazy hours of the night. To the Westwood administration, our principal, Ms. Campbell, our coaches, Mr. Henderson and Kevin Hearn, and all the coaches I've had in the past, Raphael, Gio, Arnaud, Pet. We couldn't have made it this far without you all, and I can't thank you enough. The members of the Westwood debate team, the ones that are here, the ones that have graduated previously, and the ones that are currently at home helping us out at this tournament, and wishing nothing but success for us. I also can't thank you enough. And of course, I'd like to thank Ethan for being my partner this year. I legitimately couldn't ask for anyone better. And then Berkley Prep for being formidable opponents. I hope that we have many more great debates this year. And of course, to the Barkley Forum for hosting this tournament. It's been a wonderful experience. Right. Is everyone ready? Topicality is negotiation that develops effective strategies against the race war. This is offense that straight turns the case. Affirming militant research in the abstract does nothing to aid resistance against anti-black institutions. It is a tactic of disempowerment that allows you to assuage guilt while trading ballots for political strategizing. 1. Institutional engagement. Discussion of the language of power is critical to infiltrate and outwit state action. That lets us map supply lines, coordinate protests, and identify weak points in institutions to subvert state agents who attempt to squash protest. 2. Predictable clash. Debate requires well-prepared, in-depth clash over strategies of sabotage to test the 1EC and build credible blueprints for political organization. Ask yourself, why introduce the 1EC in a competition where the negative is forced not only to respond, but to actively disagree with their strategy? The only value that introducing their scholarship is the debate that it produces, which only we solve. 3. Switch side. Changes in opinion are inevitable. We are all high schoolers in an incredibly complex world. We have changed our minds many times, and we will do so again. Only switch side operationalizes the benefits of that process. Sabotage requires being able to ardently argue and persuade people about the things you don't believe in. They make it impossible to act as state saboteurs. Filter AF offense through 2 frames. 1. Competition. Debate is structured by competitive incentives. Regardless of argument choice, when we strike judges, extend technical drops, or break new apps, everyone has the win in mind. Pedagogy can never come first because strategy will always rear its head. 2. Ballots. Voting AF does not solve their offense. Individual debate rounds don't spill over or shape our subjects. We're all influenced by classes, family, and the next 50 years of our lives. This is all magnified in the context of single debates that are drowned out over the season. The TVA. Don't treat this as a counterplan that needs to solve the AF, rather as an alternative method that would produce better debates. They can read soft left advantages about the state of the world or even copyright debate-related material, which helps them change the state of debate. All of these allow them to discuss the process of combating racism, both inside and outside of debate. Evaluate it through sufficiency. We don't need to solve the AF, rather access inroads to their scholarship. The TVA being imperfect is good. Any 1AR deficit establishes the point in being a neg team, because deficits would be neg ground. 2EC1. Debate is not a microcosm of the race war. The affirmative does not engage in violent radical resistance. They are an endorsement of sociality in debate, which is not necessarily exclusive with our interpretation. 1. False analogy. Debaters are fighting for ballots, not their lives. Tournaments take place in voluntary and extracurricular settings where the players are high schoolers. We all choose to come here, follow assigned procedure, and engage in voluntary competitions instead of showing up to protest or fundraising. 2. Double turn. Their argument betrays disingenuity from Berkeley prep at every level. They also read topicality against critical affirmatives. If they really believed there is a race war and demanded immediate endurance, they would unconditionally affirm it. 3. Question begging. We've refuted the very premise that there is a race war, so they'd have to beat our case arguments first. 4. Wrong implication. The race war doesn't justify putting procedurals on hold. Activists and organizers need fair procedures. Everyone benefits from spaces that foster respect and disagreement instead of allowing monologues that drown out opposition. 2EC2. Our interpretation. Affirmatives must be topical. Their countertip can't solve our offense. There's no bright line or definition for what militant strategies include. It also crushes predictable limits. It violates the agent and mechanism of the resolution that allows infinite possible metaphorical relationships to IP law. It allows them to defend non-physical opposition or millions of subfederal actors like the states, different grassroots collectives, or more. For example, in this debate, they'd require us to go for sociality is bad in debate, which is impossible. Now, they said Rev v. Rev debates are good. Fiat is predictable. Our 1NC Erickson evidence makes the claim that the word should in the resolution implies that we should have a hypothetical debate about the consequences of resolutional action. Our interp also does not end KVK debates. P is a provisional endorsement in this round. KVK debates can still happen in other rounds. KVK also misses the boat by pitting revolutions against each other. Instead, we should formulate tactics in response to the central antagonism, the institutions that create violence in the first place. Forcing them to engage arguments like white backlash or crackdown is the only way to improve exportable advocacy. 3. The TVA and switch sides solve their offense. Debates under our interpretation would look like AF teams reading the TVA and then neg teams going for their criticism. We'd have debates over the entire year, but which one of those methods are better, which still allows us to solve their offense and still allows us to engage in militant preservation and sociality. 2C4. They said the individuation DA. 1. Turn. Debate should not personalize argument. Bringing up intimate discussions of personal and sensitive encounters in a competitive setting is non-consensual and harmful to debaters. It puts judges in traumatic situations where ballots become referendums on identity. 2. Other forums. There are plenty of settings to discuss interpersonal violence, community dialogues, discussion sessions, organizing, or enclaves with friends. The distinction is that those settings de-emphasize competition because one side need not disagree. 3. No link. Topicality preserves the choice to include personal topics. Teams can tie their 1AC to individual experiences or embody their advantages. That's better because it facilitates those discussions only when they're desired by the debaters. 2EC5, the ethical nihilism DA. It is not false hope. Debaters don't actually believe that discussing the state makes plans actually be implemented, and that's not our impact. Our offense is all about becoming smarter, more experienced, and better people, which was debated above. 3C6, artificial legitimacy. We are also brown debaters that want to engage in plan-focused debate. We are not any more related to the state than they are, but still think the process of discussing the state is productive because it allows us to come up with strategies that help us combat the state and actualize their model. Black and brown students can choose to read advantages about the effect of government policy on those close to them, and policy inevitably affects everyone, so discussing those things is good. Now, fairness defense. I'm not going for a fairness impact, but I'll still answer internal link defense because it could matter for clash. Teams breaking new are limited by the topic. We can still engage in militant discussions versus those affirmatives. There's no incentive to run to the margins, at least outside of the bounds of predictability. Topical affirmatives are limited by the resolution, so there's still always predictable net ground that the negative can go for. Their model forces debaters from small schools with little funding to be negative on an interpretation with little ground, which makes it difficult for them to engage. That means that their model is worse for small schools with little funding. Plan text standards does not implicate predictability, limits, or ground, because teams can still go for DAs or advocate their K on the negative, and they can also go for counterplans that compete off of the words that are still in the plan text, or counterplans that compete off of the resolution. Now, clash defense. There are not natural limits. Remember, their counter-trip is militant strategies, not discussing intellectual property. They can engage any strategy that claims to change debate, which is too much of a scope of ground that we would have to negate. They said our forms of clash are good. This was all debated above, but our offense is premised off of deep testing, making us better people. We're going for clash as a straight turn to their offense. Debating under the resolution is the only way that we can actualize the benefits of their interpretation.
Okay. Are you open for cross-examination?
1 second. Yeah, I'm ready.
Let's start on your first argument about outwitting state action. 80% of policy debates now exhibit non-germane process counterplans, or the affirmative goes for theory arguments like conditionality. What do these debates do to identify weak points in the state that allow us to sabotage?
Those debates debate government policy. They debate the best ways to enact things
I understand that,
would
but
change the world.
the last affirmative speech or the last negative speech are premised on theoretical arguments like conditionality or 50-state fiat is bad. What do those have to do with teaching us how to get past things
Well, of
like a gridlocked Congress or an attitudinal inherency?
Of course, some theory debates have to exist. Debate does have to be fair, and sometimes people do unfair things in debate. We think, above all, debate is a competition, that people have to prioritize fairness. But we do think that debates over things like process counterplans are good. Although, of course, there is an incentive for teams to go for disadvantages and go for criticisms that do actually challenge the state. If you're right that
I'd
it's
like to
good,
move on.
Okay.
So you say activists and organizers need fair procedures. For the past 30 years, critical teams have been able to debate each other without defending government action. Why couldn't you?
Because critical teams currently have incentive to tie their affirmatives close to the resolution in order to beat topicality. Under your interpretation, that wouldn't exist. So critical teams would run to the margins, they'd
Does
run
our
away.
affirmative not include discussions of intellectual property as per the resolution?
We think, of course it references intellectual property, but we think that we, as the negative, didn't have predictable ground to go for versus your affirmative. That makes it difficult to test and means that we'll never actually understand if militant preservation is a good thing or something that we should engage in, because we weren't prepared to test it.
Okay, that brings me to my next question. If predictability is solely based off the words in the resolution, how did you have negative case cards that answer the thesis of the race war?
Predictability isn't just based off the resolution. There are, of course, other things that matter. Debate has changed over time. People read critical apps.
Great.
But we do think that under
That
your
brings me to-
interpretation,
okay,
people would run to the
that's all.
margins and read even more unpredictable apps. Of course, what we had versus race war was not a complete case neg. We didn't have DAs. We didn't have a counterpart
But you
that
were
picked
able
out
to
of pure
challenge the
offense.
thesis reading cards that say the premise of the race war is incorrect.
We don't think that's nearly enough.
Okay.
Like we think that
We can move on.
under our interpretation, we'd be able to actually challenge the
I'd like to ask
the-
another
the
question.
substance of the race war.
So topicality, you say teams under your interpretation can still tie their 1ACs to individual experiences.
Right.
Why would your arguments about having to disagree with people's experiences not equally apply here?
Argument is that affirmative teams, if they wanted to, could still choose to tie their 1AC close to their experiences.
Yeah, and you have
Negative
said
teams
that
could
is
also do the
bad,
same
but
thing.
you do not preclude it.
We didn't say that was bad. What do you mean?
No, you said it is bad to debate about things like racism or personal experiences because it puts judges in uncomfortable situations. But you have said
that's against
teams-
your argument that people should debate about it. If you're right that people should debate about personal experience, then they can choose to tie their 1AC close to them. Of course, this is different than like a microaggression in debate, right? Like people can talk about things that are related to them without talking about their direct personal experience.
Can I understand?
Oh, yeah.
I've sent the doc. The order of this speech will be first the criticism, and then I will go to the case. Let me know whenever you can.
There is a doc, right?
Correct. Sorry if I didn't mention that earlier. Okay. everybody good? Cool. And we'll start. The criticism. We are no longer forwarding this position. I'm kicking out of it. I will answer the arguments that may implicate the other block positions we have taken. The ballot does not do anything in this round or set a precedent. 1. Multiple other critical teams have won quintessential rounds that advocate similar arguments they've made on the framework page. For example, Wake Forest, Long Beach, North Broward, etc. There's no reason that Berkeley Prep needs to win this debate to set a precedent. Second, is Berkeley Prep winning this debate does not send a signal that makes people research. Instead, it makes people believe that Berkeley Prep simply beat us on the line, but not in truth, which makes them improve their topicality blocks, but not research their method. Third, is even if we win this debate, multiple K teams forward different arguments, for example, settler colonialism, Asian fiction, pessimism, etc., which proves that they can't only encourage research over their strategy, which means they cannot solve any of the 1AC's offense. Now I'll go to the case. We are not in the midst of a race war. Relations are getting better in similar mirrors the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act, and activist movements have made life better. Berkeley Prep's re-highlightings misread our evidence. The card says that despite racial tensions, we're not fighting a literal race war. Then it says, when it says white Americans despise BLM, that was a quote from a reporter, not a claim made by our author. The last portion of our card says the 1960s black militants believed violence was unavoidable. This proves we're right that things can get better as per the post-1960s movement, thanks to civil rights activism. We will read in yellow. O'Reilly has insisted. Tensions continue to mount back in 1967, and Nelson argues that. Now, the next argument about the Seska card is wrong. The author agrees that violence exists, but our argument is simply that things are getting better. There can be violence, and we do agree that it's bad, but it's not a reason that the race war always has to persist, or that we need to advocate in debate in order to stop it. Regardless, all of their arguments about there being a rise of militantism and white supremacy on the case are our argument on topicality, because our argument is that only our model of framework can incentivize students to research and change their neural biases to actually change their methods. Voting affirmative in this debate or for their model cannot do anything to solve any Berkeley Prep's arguments about white supremacy, because we will never be able to predict it, and we will never be able to combat those structures if we can't change our neural biases and test our ideas. There is not a race war. Riley Swank. Race relations have empirically never been better. Incidents are quite rare, so too is serious interracial crimes. The media's sensational fixation has grown steadily in recent years. It is impossible not to see media coverage as a factor contributing to this malice. Right-wing media take the tack sensationalizing virtually every prominent story of black and white crime. The alt-right maintains a black and white crime archive. It is tempting to ask, do you have an epidemic of white and black crimes or the epidemic of brutish black and white crimes? The answer is neither. Statistics so far thoroughly refute a fear-mongering that Americans should take to media to task for divisive false claims of reality that they seem present. The reality is far from the race war fantasies of extremists on either side. The absolute absence of a race war in America is the most obvious murder. Figures indicate that roughly 85% of murders are interracial, and the big picture of interracial crimes and ethnic conflicts, or more broad, is a surprisingly positive one. There is no current or upcoming race war, or indeed general epidemic of interracial violence. Now, the examples that Berkeley Prep has listed do not prove that there is a race war. 1. This is a bad methodology. For each example, there's also dozens of interactions with different races and minorities with the state and police that do not result in death. For their theory to be correct, they have to win that every single interaction results in violence towards minorities. 2 is violence is distinct from war. Their examples reveal violence not organized by coordinated fighting. Trump came out of his bunker, Congress and the public pressured away from declaring a state of emergency, and there are clearly no general sides or generals. The central thesis of the criticism is also bankrupt. There is not a race war. Their authors are English professors who use inflammatory language, but massively lack empirical data. They have some compelling anecdotes, but those just prove that there are problematic policies in place that we should reform and change as per our topicality arguments. Not that the government is irredeemably racist. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and they haven't provided enough of that. Actual statistics and studies show that over time, racial biases outcome have been improving, claims to the contrary of the media sensationalism. Our argument is true, even though their intentions aren't the same as people using concept directly for white supremacy. Story 12. One of my students innocently used the phrase race war. I say innocently because he did not possess a full understanding of that phrase's racist pedigree. He merely tried to capture the tensions. What my student couldn't have known is that the race war is a trick of political rhetoric that was meant To match the dynamics of racism, spin takes on the weight of history. It is repeated enough. Race war similarly distorts reality. Race war was often brandished as a threat to civil libertarians demanded to end apartheid. They were told would spark a race war. My students didn't know any better.
We'll begin.
Stop prep. We have 6:20 remaining.
The order will be case and then topicality. All of the arguments that the 1NR made on the negation K will be answered on topicality. And I'm sending out a doc right now while we wait.
I'm sorry, the order again. I know it's a very simple order.
It's case and then topicality.
Yes.
Oh, is everybody here? I thought we were missing someone for some reason.
I stood up for a second, but I'm back.
Okay. I don't know how we know if someone was missing, but
I think this is a.
It's all right.
all right. Sounds good.
Don't get our last two speeches.
Yeah.
There's enough of us. We'll take it.
It's happened before.
Okay. Westwood?
Yep.
Vote affirmative for militant preservation to turn inwards to an indebted, incomplete field that halts violent individuation, that saps the social energy needed for black and brown students to endure ongoing racial violence and organize in the real world. There is a race war now. They misunderstand our arguments. Even if literal physical violence is getting better because of surveillance, like their BD evidence says, that deters white supremacists, the classroom is being colonized every day by white supremacists. The 1EC Basicer evidence says that Trump's election magnified immigration tensions, DEI conflicts, and the ban of CRT in schools all over the country, which all ensure the inevitable rise of racist attitudes. Their Riley evidence goes our way. Their card says, quote, 71% of African Americans see race relations as generally bad and think they have worsened under Trump. That card was published during his first term. Violence will certainly only rise in his second term without pressures to be palatable to liberal re-electors. The Riley evidence goes on to say that the people behind the media sensationalizing racial violence are far right wingers, which also answers the last card read in the speech. We have never made the claim that every interracial interaction is an instance of war or violence, so you should never hold us to the standard that the 1AR establishes. We should reform policies, we agree, but mutual aid is a prerequisite, as the 1NR simply has no response to the 2EC claim that restoring the social energy and giving black and brown communities the resources to organize, like the BPP Breakfast Club programs, is a prerequisite for them to be able to engage or ever join resistance efforts in the first place. Now, go to topicality. You should filter topicality through uniqueness. We agree that nobody in debate is fighting for their lives, but the scholarship over which we iterate is poisoned by the race war. Instructors are decreasingly diverse, and DEI cuts ensure will only get worse. Literature is being blocked out now, proved by all of the analysis I did on case. That means there is zero chance that their model is capable of solving intellectual humility. If you looked at a plan text in any modern policy app, you would find it far harder to interpret than our 1EC. Their model does not encourage clash, but cowardice. The truancy cross-examination is exactly our point. Only ideological tests, not process counterplan debates or conditionality, are able to deconstruct the research practices of the race war. This is also an impact turn to their model. Without the infusion of racial scholarship, they maintain the academic echo chamber that classrooms across the nation are increasingly becoming, which ensures that the people trained under their model only use their skills in racist ways. We have never read topicality, and when we are negative versus chaos, I go for the capitalism K, picks out of scholarship, etc. All of those things I find to be the most generative and enjoyable debates. Now, you should prefer our model. Only our cards are written by debate coaches about debate, so you can trust their perspective. The Anasopoulos and Shigino evidence cites a multitude of ways that non-state-centric debates create the revolutionary skills necessary to fight in the race war. Instead of the restrictive framework of fiat, we should seek to question what influences social relations nationally. Our evidence gives examples like complex intra-literature debates between Sexton, Wilderson, Tiffany King that have given everybody the critical thinking skills to organize. Predictability is misplaced. Fiat is just a tradition that overrepresents traditional epistemologies. Anasopoulos and Shigino say that many teams do not find it predictable or accessible, and it's no more arbitrary than our interpretation. In any ways, the reason RF is unpredictable, if it is because of the race war. The 1AC's uniqueness claim is that the race war has poisoned academia, debates, classrooms around the country, etc. Your ballot corrects that, which will be addressed later on. We do not require them to say sociality is bad, but that politics should be oriented elsewhere. Now, in Truancy Cross-Ex, Pranav says that the only reason why KVK debates are possible now is because advocacies must be tied to the topic. Our model solves that. We say that their resolution is a good stasis, but we should react rather than affirm, ensuring that, in their own words, workable ground for the negative. The net benefit is our Traber evidence, which says their interpretation teaches worse advocacy skills, and collective action and NGO movements cannot be separated from the process of advocacy. Durable fiat skips through all the hardest parts of organizing. They never teach you how to organize, who to organize with, etc. Instead, they durably fiat through those obstacles. When debaters go out into the world after 4 years under their model, they'll be shocked and disappointed to find that their skills they've gained from debate are inapplicable to politics, resulting in a loss of agency and ultimately resignation to systems of power. That answers their arguments about institutional engagement. Testing how to subvert supply lines is clearly only available in our model. Now, the ballot solves. The negative claims that your ballots are a drop in the bucket, but they cannot explain why there is an ocean in front of you. This debate must be a question of models of debate. They may be a 99% risk that the ballot does nothing, but the off chance it can set a norm or encourage ethical scholarship is an imperative to vote affirmative to train militants willing and able to fight in the race war. The erasure of critical scholarship also eliminates most of the programs that provide opportunities to debaters at this very tournament. In our home state of Florida and many others, it's the only space where we can speak about racial theory. Now, this debate does send a signal. This debate is a tutorial, does not prioritize ticky-tacky line by line, so people believe we won because of our arguments, not tech. There is no TBA. Ask yourself, how does a policy act that combats racism solve our framework offense? It's about how we ought not simulate politics to begin with. Now, switching sides is our argument. We should not begin with a fiated proposal, then react with non-state advocacy. We should instead never iterate over fiated proposals, since disagreeing with the affirmative at its level ensures we get trapped in our offense, which is explained above.
Okay, 8 minutes. Or which?
7:31.
Oh, 7:31.
That's hysterical. Any other teams? Okay, that's all, then all is right with the world, so we're back. Yeah, yeah. Were they branded jerseys or were they specific player jerseys? Yours?
I have a judge.
Yeah, okay. Good. If you have to go with these. I mean, I would also let us know just on general quick particular the best to describe it February. You do have the press pretty big for our press injuries, so I mean, we'll have to do it. But right now, which is honestly the thing I want to do. Just like G Chang's death, I appreciate that. It's like the last thing I have to do today. So that's not really what? Oh. Yeah, it's bad. Hey, what happened in Westwood? Oh, it's me. Yeah.
Is everyone ready? The order is topicality and then case. Believe it or not. Right.
Right.
Everyone all ready? Berkley Cup, good?
Yep.
Okay. Vote negative for negation. This is both an external impact about our ability to clash and fairly contest the case, but also a straight turn to developing strategies that can then be deployed effectively against the race war outside debate. We are substantially ahead on top-level framing. Topicality turns and outweighs their offense for 3 reasons. 1, institutions. Militant resistance fails if it is incapable of understanding the language of power. Discussions of political trade-offs, fiat, and the costs and downsides of topical action are necessary to infiltrate political spaces. They train us to act as saboteurs who outwit and arm twist white supremacists by identifying weak points in armed opposition. Otherwise, violent response is inevitable and turns the case. 2, predictability. The 1AR concedes that effective, predictable clash is a prerequisite to solving the case. Without a predictable stasis for competition, Berkley Prep allows teams to advocate advocacies that run from the margins and avoid clash. Their model teaches debaters that the optimal strategy is to avoid criticism, not engage with it. Only exposure to negation produces argumentative refinement, because if you want to win, you must improve. The only external impact to debate arrives through the process of clash. Militant research requires iterative testing that is rigorously scrutinized by opponents. 3, switch side. Our interpretation is better for, quote, ideological tests and deconstructing research practices. Dogmatism is the death of effective resistance. The presumption that 4 high schoolers have figured things out and that Berkley Prep's way or nothing is incredibly shallow and makes us ineffective advocates who are incapable of persuading or building coalitions to combat white supremacy in the real world. They said we should never iterate over fiated proposals. Our argument is that there's a possibility that engaging through topical affirmatives is good, and that the state is a powerful agent that we should discuss. Now, the negative can also win debates by reading their criticism on the negative, which solves their offense. Debate is not a microcosm of the race war. It is a competition that both us and Berkley Prep have chosen to engage in as minority debaters that have faced racism. The race war doesn't justify putting procedural questions on hold. We can agree that a race war is happening now and try to preserve a vision of debate that fosters the best strategies to actually combat racism outside of debate. Their method is counterproductive and fails. Describing racism outside as a war and saying that we need militant resistance is counterproductive if what we actually need in debate is sociality. That proves their method is co-opted both in and out of debate. Lastly, we've proven that debaters aren't literally fighting for their lives on the case page, which they conceded in the 1AR. They said scholarship is poisoned by the race war. Berkley Prep's 1AR concedes that teams are free to innovate related to the race war. Teams can read their affirmative on the negative, which still allows their method to win debates and be compared to other militant strategies. Our interpretation doesn't cause a race to the bottom or margin or bad debates. You should frame this through possibility. There are many valuable critical debates that occur versus policy affirmatives that our interpretation endorses but theirs excludes. Berkley Prep drops that the one feature that binds every debater is that they want to win. The reason that process counterplates might skirt ground is because debaters' primary incentive is desire for the ballot. However, Berkley Prep concedes that they can't solve it and make it far worse. They can't prevent people from interpreting militant strategy as something to run from the margins and skirt clash. Debating process counterpoints is good. Learning about implementation of federal policy does not sidestep the F, but asks the hard questions about how the F's lofty goals would actually be received. If they're correct, think about their model. The NEG has no generics that we can apply. We'll be forced to go for impulsionist impact turns that stereotype their arguments. Our model is not an echo chamber. TVA and Switchside can incorporate their curriculum while structuring institutions as our point of analysis. That solves better. It forces tailored critiques and nuanced refutation to the one who sees assumptions rather than totalizing generics. Fiat is not a tradition. It's the most predictable reading of the resolution as per our Arison Evans. He's also a debate coach writing about debate. Debaters have advocated for fiated policy action for decades and have had to answer the critique when they are affirmative. The affirmative's interpretation is the end of debate. Teams would run to the margins to find the most difficult cases to answer, independently crushing our ability to negate. It allows infinite possible metaphorical relationships to militant preservation. We have straight-turned revolutionary skills. Starting points matter. We should affirm the state instead of permanently reacting to it because it's the central antagonism. We can compare the efficacy of various critical stances, including militant preservation, over the course of the year when pit against the state. They missed the vote by pitting methods against each other. They said this is a tutorial. We agree with their premise that this is a debate about models of debate. Vote negative to send the signal that our model of debate is best for activist skills. You should compare the specific iterative clash-based features of our model to the features of theirs. The ballot equally sends a signal for our model of debate, so it solves our offense case. We are not in the midst of a race war. 1NC Beatty says that there's a way forward that the world is looking up. For example, people have been able to fight back against white militants by using technologies like cameras as a deterrent. The status quo mirrors the 1960s, where even if there were struggles, the way out was through developing new skills, such as the ones on Framework, in order to combat the race war. Our Riley evidence is much better than Berkeley Prep gives it credit for. Yes, it does cite a study that says the statistic they cited. However, it then goes on to question whether a race war exists at all. Quote, it is tempting to ask, do we have an epidemic of white on black crimes? Then they conclude, quote, the answer is neither. Anti-black violence has declined for decades and a majority of violence occurs intra-racially.
Do you remember if you have 620? 620.
debate and topic out. Okay. Is everyone ready? The whole panel's good? Great. The question you should all ask yourselves is that in the face of racialized crackdown in educational spaces, what is our ethical imperative here and now in Barkley Forum Finals? Our offense outweighs black and brown people need to strategize now. Uniqueness is very affirmative. Trump is president, and we are fighting for our lives. Things like assaults on critical race theory, police violence, massive militarization, and assaults on DEI mean there's a categorical imperative to put normal debate functioning on hold, and is the framing for the rest of the counterinterpretation debate on topicality. Look, regardless of how persuasive you think the 2&R was on race relations favorable now, they did not answer the explicit 1AR argument that funding cuts and banning of CRT means education now gets polarized to the right, so the social climate will as well in the future. That makes debate a unique site of resistance in the face of a massive crackdown on critical scholarship. The Beatty evidence, their examples of civil rights, flow affirmative. They are our argument. Debates must start from the bottom up, and bottom-up organizing if we ever want to create change. They concede this premise multiple times. Their Riley card really is as terrible as we say it is. It cites the statistic that, quote, 71% of black people perceive race relations to be generally bad and perceive them to get worse under Trump. That was during his first term, and they've conceded that it will definitely be way worse the second time around, which means we have one that there is a race war, especially when their own evidence says races are terrified of one another. Topicality. This debate is a question of models. What skills we gather as a community of activists and what we aim to inculcate. The 2&R has missed the forest for the trees. Why bother getting better at argumentation on their model when we skip over the steps of how to organize, who to organize with, how do we overcome attitudinal inherency in Congress, magnified by Trump flipping courts, Congress flipping red? How do we lobby? Westwood has no answer in the 2&R. What you know is that conditionality and trashy counterplan debates definitely do not teach us that. That's our Traber evidence. This means no matter if their model can make us better arguers, we become better arguers with no ability or desire to resolve real-world problems. We solve all of their offense better because we train those abilities to defend our convictions, but with better ethical principles. Remember the frame from 2AC cross-examination. An infinitesimally small amount of us will ever be intrinsic to state, while all of us will be movement or can be movement organizers. That means even if you think it is best for us to be legislators, only 1% of us can, while all of us can be movement organizers, which means it is best to prioritize the majority. Our model also solves institutional engagement since we force apps to question the resolution and they can critique it. Our 1AC began with critiques of America's political climate, current standing court cases, etc., which is textual analysis as inherency for a critique. They conceded 2NC examples by how planning to subvert supply lines, create mutual aid networks, are only possible under a model. Predictability. They conceded predictability is not solely resolutionary based. They conceded in cross-examination. Ask yourself, why is it that Westwood had case cards to an answered affirmative that is supposedly unpredictable and a model that is, quote, the end of debate? The answer is because predictability is based on community trends. That proves this ballot solves. Proven their examples by Wake, North Broward, etc., all of whom spilled out to influence the community's broader argumentative trends. They say militant research requires testing, but our counterinterpret solves that. Our 2AC Anastopoulos Seguido card is the only one that speaks to educational value of method debates written by experienced debate coaches. Instead of the restrictive framework of fiat, we should seek to question the social relations naturally. The 2&R has no example to any of our examples. Complex inter-literature debates between Sexton, Wilderson, Tiffany King have given everyone the critical thinking skills to organize. Switchside nor the TVA solve every round where the AF can fiat a plan, betrays the possibilities of this community to inspire change. Under their model, they would simply durably fiat racism to be a thing of the past, which leaves no role for negation or questioning how we should get there. If the negative responds with a K, 99% of 2As around the country would choose to cop out and go for framework anyways, which means they dodge our form of clash. Debate as a competitive space should be low priority in a tutorial which was explained above, but their assertion of our competitive incentives should be assigned to 0. Wait, when we decided to read this app in finals of a tournament in hopes of setting a norm, They say impulsion is impact turns. This is not true and a ridiculous premise. Just because apps say death or racism bad does not mean the negative has to say death good or racism good. They can negate through methods like the CAPK or afro-pessimism, which they have conceded have 30 years of empirical possibility, which prove that they are not unlimited nor unpredictable and can be generated. Also, they conceded our argument about plain text standards. Plain text standards right now look like copy-pasting the resolution to a document, adding or subtracting 2 or 3 words, which makes it extremely hard to go for arguments like disads as well, because no one is sure exactly what plain text do, which means Erickson is irrelevant because you should prioritize making critical debate your focus here and now. Thank you.